Hi everybody, Scott Hard's back again for yet another edition of Boss Builds, and voila, we have ourselves a tank. If you've been following along, at the end of our last episode, we finally got all the big chunks to come together and make us a beautiful Jagdtiger. This is the early version that we built from this convertible kit, Blitz by Takom, the first in their new series of lower cost, easy to build kits, and I couldn't be happier. Everything went together really simply, and I hope you got that impression as you were following along in these videos. Thank you again for that, by the way. But obviously, we still have one very important step to complete, which is painting our tank. Now, if you've never painted a tank before, or painted anything before for that matter, perhaps you've only worked on snap fit kits that were molded in color, because those are pretty easy to do, I'm sure the painting step can seem very intimidating at first. But hopefully I'll be able to explain it well enough that you'll understand that it really isn't that hard after all. Make everything clear as I can going along. And what we're going to do as we paint this tank is we're going to use products from a company called Ammo by MIG. And these are all acrylic paints, water-based paints that are really easy to use, don't have a lot of crazy smelly fumes that are going to stink up your house or your workplace as you work with them. And I think they're very easy to work with, and hopefully I can show that as well as we move forward. So step one is going to be priming, where we cover the whole tank in one color in order to give the other colors that we're going to put on a good base to adhere to. Let's dive in and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, we are ready to paint. We've got our Jagdtiger all ready to go, as you saw in our last episode. And now we're going to put some paint on this. Now today, we're going to talk a lot about airbrushes. I've got my trusty Tamiya airbrush here all ready to go. And if you already know how to use an airbrush or you own one, you might find large sections of today's video to be particularly unhelpful, because I'm going to be talking basically to newbies or people who have been intimidated by the idea of using an airbrush in the past. So we're going to talk about a lot of basic pointers of airbrushes. Now, before we can start using an airbrush to do anything to this tank, we can't forget, but we've used photo etch parts on this. And as you can see, of course, on the back deck, there's all the PE. And paints for plastic models do not adhere well to photo etch parts at all if you haven't primed them properly. So that's what we're going to do first. Now, what I have here is my Gunze or GSI Mr. Metal Primer, and this is a very commonly available metal primer, a hobby primer, that's available here in Japan, of course, and also in some markets overseas. But if you can't find the Gunze stuff, you should be able to find its equivalent or something else you can use to do the same job either online or at your local hobby shop. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out by priming the photo etch parts on the back deck of the tank. Okay, we've given the back deck metal parts here a few minutes to dry, and now we're ready to start the next step in the process, which is priming the tank. And as I mentioned before, we're going to use the Ammo by MIG series of acrylic or water-based paints on this tank, and we're going to put on their one-shot primer in a few minutes here, and to do that, we're going to use an airbrush. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to assume that you are not familiar with airbrushes, that you don't have any experience with it, and kind of give you a quick introduction, because they're really not as intimidating as they may seem like they are. Now, I've been, building plastic models now for probably close to 40 years. And if you really want to enjoy modeling to its fullest, I think an airbrush is a modest investment that's going to last you a lifetime. To be perfectly honest, I have two Tamiya airbrushes, and I think I've had them for over 20 years at this point, and they still work just great. Now, you can go out there online or into a local shop and probably find yourself a nice set that includes a basic handpiece like this and a small compressor for anywhere from, say, $150 to $250. Now, if that seems like too big of an investment for something you're not sure if you really want to do, you can also find much cheaper hand pieces, more in the $30 to $50 range, and you can also, instead of using a compressor, you can connect them with a little hose to cans of compressed air. So it's an extremely economical way to get into it and actually try your hand at airbrushing before you make a larger investment and you're sure you want to get into it permanently. But I can't recommend them highly enough, because they really open up a whole nother dimension to what you can do with modeling. Now, if you're going to get an airbrush, make sure that you get a double action airbrush. There are basically two types of airbrushes, double action and single action. Now, what's the difference? This is the double action brush that I have, and this is a single. Now, the difference is that a double action brush can control two things at once, specifically the air and the flow of the paint. You can control the flow of the air by pushing up and down on the button here, on the control, and you can control the flow of paint by pulling back on it, like this. So you can move in two directions or two axes at once and control both airflow and paint flow, hence the name double action. Now with a single action airbrush, it's, as the name implies, just single. All you can do is control whether paint flows or doesn't flow. The airflow itself cannot be controlled with this. This is basically just an on-off button on this particular brush. But you can ahead of time, you can adjust these stems on the back here to control the amount of air that you're getting through the brush. So it's impossible to adjust it while you're in the midst of painting, but you can go ahead and pre-adjust it. Now, typically, a single action brush, like I said, is not recommended for scale modeling. Single action airbrushes primarily exist for things like people who are doing other types of arts and crafts that involve much larger areas that don't require as much precise control as you need when you're scale modeling. Body painting or all kinds of other types of things I've seen people using single action brushes for. However, in scale modeling, there is a place for a single action brush as well, and that's why I have one. And that is when you're painting a single color on a relatively large surface and you don't need precision. In fact, I could actually use it for the next step that we're going to do because I'm going to spray this primer all over this entire tank. It doesn't require any kind of precision on my part at all. It's just one color and just going on. So it really doesn't matter which of these airbrushes that I use in this case. But I prefer my double, and I'm used to using my double quite a bit more than my single. So I'm going to go with the double for today. So now that you've got your airbrush ready to go and you're going to start painting, now it's time for us to talk about the paint. Now what we're going to be using today, again, is the Ammo by MIG one-shot primer. Now they advertise that this doesn't require any kind of preparation at all. You can just put it straight into the paint cup and off you go. But typically you're always going to need to thin paints before you use them for airbrushing. If you use like a lacquer or an enamel or most typical paints, you're going to probably need to thin it out at least 2 to 1 using the approved thinner for whatever paint line you're using. Typically, paints when they're going into an airbrush are going to be as thin as water or look just about like water. And we'll get a closer look at this kind of process when we get into the painting the camouflage of the paint. But for today, we're just going to start out by doing the primer and shooting it all over this tank. And that's what we'll finish on for this episode. And we'll show more advanced techniques using the airbrush in our later episodes. But let's get started on the priming process now. Okay, we are now ready to get started with some actual airbrushing. So of course, we need to actually put some paint into the airbrush. So we take our MIG one-shot here, and without thinning it, as the label requests, we just put some into the paint cup here. Alrighty, that should be enough for now. And we have to turn on the compressor, but before I do that, there's one other important safety thing I want to talk about. Now, as you've probably noticed, I'm wearing an apron. Now, that's just because I don't want to get goop all over my clothes. And of course, if you're careful, you can avoid that. But, sometimes things happen. And it's my advice that you might want to wear an apron to keep your clothing clean. Because you'll never get the paint back out if you do get something on your clothes. But either that or just wear something that's a total junker t-shirt or whatever as you're doing this work. But the other thing that you're going to want when you're airbrushing is a mask. Now, these days, everybody's pretty familiar with masks, but you're going to be putting, fine particulates of paint into the air, and you're going to be breathing them because you'll be in close proximity to what you're doing. Now, with the MIG paints, these aren't particularly noxious. I wouldn't go so far as to call them safe. But with these paints, there's not that much smell, but if you use a lacquer-based paint or some enamels, you're absolutely positively going to want to have a mask on at all times, or you will regret it. So keep that in mind as we get into the process here. So I'll be wearing this mask here. And of course, now we turn on the compressor. And before we start actually painting our model, we're going to, of course, test things out and see how it's going here. So this is just a piece of copy paper. And yeah, looks like it's working. Now the fun part, of course, about a double action is that you can twist this knob on the back to control the flow, or the maximum amount of flow you can let in. So if you crank that down, let me see, I can go a little bit farther, you can actually work it so that you can get a really fine line going. And you have a lot of control here, So this is the basic way, with practice of course, that you paint your tank. Now today we're really not going to need this kind of finesse at all on what we're about to do. because we're just going to put this this brown color primer all over the tank. Now, one reason actually this color, this primer is brown, is because this is the color of the actual primer that was used on German tanks in World War II. Now, since we're going to have a lot of surface area to do, we're just going to take this out and bring in our baby here. And we're going to open up the valve on the back here to get a broader stream going. And before I start really going to work on it, I'm also going to do a test shot on the actual tank, but I'm going to do it on the bottom, because this is a great place where you can test things and make mistakes without having them visible later. So I've opened this up quite a bit here, and I think I need to open it up a bit more. Okay, there we go. So we can actually open it up even more than this if we want to cover more at a time. I think we will. There we are. Now we're keeping the airbrush about 10 to 15 centimeters from the model, because the worst thing you can do in airbrushing is get too much paint in one area and start to get a run going where the paint actually drips down. So you don't want to stop in any one place, and you don't want to get too close to the model, especially when you've got it on close to full blast like I've got it right now. Don't worry about getting a little paint on your fingertips. It'll come right off, usually with soap and water later. If that does bother you, however, the other way that a lot of guys like to paint is by using a turntable like the one I've got here that came with my spray box. And this way you can just put your model on the turntable, and then as you're working with it, you can just turn it and work your way around the tank. So that's pretty convenient as well. Alright, I'm just going to get into it and get this thing done now. Of course, we don't want to forget the inside of the openable hatches. Oops. And voila! Now we have a brown tank instead of a green tank. So yeah, the MIG primer went on quite nicely, I thought. And there's one thing about this MIG primer that I cannot show you on video, and that is the smell, or the lack thereof. I'm quite impressed, actually, because one of the problems with, lacquer type paints is if you use them in your house, you're going to be smelling it for a good 2 or 3 hours afterwards at least, and that's even if you open all the windows and stuff. But this really isn't making much odor at all, and I will admit it's the first time I've tried it, and I'm quite impressed. We are not being paid to say that, by the way, but I thought I would throw that in there. Now that we're done for now with the priming of the tank, the next step is going to be, of course, clean up the airbrush. Now, this is a very important step if you want your airbrush to have a nice, long, and happy life. Now, we've still got about a centimeter of paint in the cup here after I finish the job. So what I'm going to do, because I like to conserve resources, is I'm going to very carefully pour what I can of the excess back into the bottle here. And cap that back up immediately so we don't have a disaster. But we still, of course, have a lot of paint inside of the paint cup here on the airbrush. So to get rid of most of the rest of that, we're just going to take a tissue and wipe it out. As much of it as we can. And even that, of course, is not going to completely clean it out. There's still, as you can see down into the base of the cup, there is still some brown primer in there. Now, to remove that, since we can't get it out with the tissue or whatever, we're going to use paint thinner. Now, this particular brand and almost all brands will also market their own thinners and cleaners. But I have found that good old lacquer thinner, aka paint thinner, is also pretty much universally able to take out just about anything. I've got some paint thinner in a little used jam jar here that I use for these purposes. And I'm just going to pour a little bit of this into there. There we are. And now we're going to start blowing it through the piece to clean it out. Now I'm going to move my tank because I don't want to get any thinner on that. And turn the compressor back on. And now we just start spraying again. I'm going to open the piece all the way up so we get maximum pressure and flow through this here. And there's one other important step you need to do while you're cleaning your airbrush with the thinner. And that's what the Japanese call gargling. I don't know what it's called in English, but you just kind of force the air piece to backflow by plugging the tip with your finger and then pulling the lever. And maybe you can hear the bubbly noises here as we blow thinner backwards through the piece to clean it out. So we're just blowing out the last of the thinner here. And while there's still a little bit of thinner left in the paint cup, we're going to wipe that tissue around in there, and voila, nice and clean. Got some paint on the outside of the cup too, but if you take that off with a little bit of paint thinner, that comes right off too. Now there's one other part of the brush that we want to clean as well, and that's the tip right here. Now this is actually the most important part of the airbrush, and if that clogs up, then you're not going to be able to do anything. So to clean that, we're going to use a paintbrush, and we're going to put some thinner on that and swirl it around the tip of the brush. So we just take some thinner here and clean the tip of the brush with that. You may need a few cycles of brushing away the paint and then a tissue to clean it before you get it to the point that you're happy with it. This tip area, of course, is also the biggest difference that you'll experience between relatively inexpensive airbrushes and really nice ones. Of course, the Iwata makes a series of airbrushes that are kind of the standard, or the gold standard for the industry. Definitely can't go wrong if you purchase an Iwata, like their Eclipse or other popular models. But there are a number of lesser known brands these days that I must admit I've never tried, but you may want to give them a shot if you're looking for something a bit more economical. So yeah, it looks like we've got most of the gunk out of the tip of the airbrush there. Now, you don't need to do this every single time, but after you've done several color changes and maybe completed your tank model or whatever model it is you're working on, you also want to do a more thorough cleaning of the airbrush, where you actually disassemble it and clean out the internal parts. And that's beyond the scope of today's video, but that's something that as an airbrush owner you would want to know how to do. And typically the instructions that come with the airbrush will show how it disassembles and how you can take care of that. Alright, I think I'm happy with that. Okay, we got her done. We got all the primer completed, and the next step in the finishing process is going to be applying our base coat of the main color for the tank, which we'll be using, of course, the German yellow to do that for this late war scheme. And we'll start doing that in our next episode, as long as getting to work on the camouflage, again with our trusty airbrush. So tune in for our next episode. Thanks a lot for watching.